I'm going to take you on a journey today to try to convince you of why web-assisted annotation is such a great tool to use and to think about implementing it and having this, using this tool for enhancing your curation. I do hope that we can use a little bit of the emojis that you all have to ask some questions just to make it a little fun and interactive. So again, we're just going to go through a little bit about what I mean by web-assisted annotation, and again, reviewing and taking you on a journey of those pain points for curation and how a curation is performed, and really how can the biocuration process benefit from annotation, an additional point, and just some future plans that we have. And then I'll go through a live review of Hypothesis and how it's been used across some of our expert panels to help with variant and gene curation. And we can certainly take questions along the way. I'll be able to monitor the chat a little bit more once we go live, but please, if you have any questions, put it in there and I will do my best to see those chat and take those questions, even if it's after this presentation. So let's just get a view of what is annotation to begin with. So per the dictionary, an annotation just means a note of explanation, a comment added to text or a diagram. Oftentimes it's able to provide additional context. So get yourself ready for your emojis, but let's see by a show of hands or reactions, how many of you have actually been known to do this with your books, with papers, while you're reading, or even during your curations? I'm sure many of you have gone ahead and taken on this type of reaction that you've had and trying to figure out additional notes and studying. As you can see, in some parts, it seems to be useful, but as the image shows over here on the left, oftentimes these little tabs can fall out. We begin to forget context, and then we're writing all over the top of the words. So what are some pros to this? Well, as we mentioned, one can add additional context, insights to the data, get you to be able to understand a little bit more in depth about words that are there. What's the cons? Well, the picture is pretty much self-explanatory of what the con is for this. So it's really trying to figure out, is there a better way? Because having additional context or some structure to what we're reading to understand it is a real benefit. So when we think about web-assisted annotation in general, what is that? Well, similar to what we had there, it's being able to use a web application, right, to be able to annotate a file. So show of hands now, how many of you have actually used one of these tools? I'm sure many of you have. Google Docs is something that is just becoming more and more prevalent, especially because it does allow to have a little bit of commenting those annotations in a conversation on a document, right? Multiple people at the same time. So instead of those manuscripts that you used to go through person after person or author after author, one after the other, or you'd have to collate all their information from different notes, you can all do it on the same time. The same is now true with Adobe Acrobat. Again, a commenting kind of tool where you can add those annotations to the text, and even in Microsoft with their OneDrive markup. But again, as powerful and as useful as these tools are, because they do provide those additional concepts, context and insights, they do have those thoughts linked to the text. You're highlighting text and now linking a comment. So that's an additional factor on top of the regular annotation. It is somewhat organized in a neat fashion, and those conversations, as we mentioned, can happen in real time on the text. But there's still some cons to this. There are limitations to the file type. Google Docs are great, but it's a document, it's a Word document, or potentially an Excel file, but I think you've all probably tried commenting on an Excel file in Google, and it can be quite difficult. And then how do you really find this information? You still have to scroll through all of the different comments to figure out which ones are applicable to you. You can certainly tag people with their email address to highlight the ones, but you can't really figure out what comment went where. And when you have a text like our SOP over here that is almost 70 pages long, it still becomes quite cumbersome when you have a specific area to annotate. So now, what is Hypothesis, and what is this for web-based annotation? Well, just to give you some background, Hypothesis is a web-based annotation tool, and it follows a specific W3C annotation standard. And this is where it links the text to the annotation directly within a web page. any web page. So you can go to scientific articles, you can go to a shopping screen because you want to do your Christmas shopping and keep everybody organized. Or say you want a new car and you're going through CarMax or the Honda site or whatever car dealer site. You can highlight those things and you can begin to understand the text, you can understand the car. And not only that, there are some enhanced capabilities we'll go through in a little bit later so that it can still keep your interest in this. But now the big question is, can a web-based annotation help curation? And if so, how does it do that? So let's take a little bit of a journey through the biocuration process and let's think about where this can help us. So curation pain points. I'm sure many of you will agree, one of the biggest pain points for all curation efforts is searching for applicable evidence to evaluate and score classifications. We spend an abnormally large amount of time on this step. We need to look through PubMed or different articles, LitVar databases, so that we can look either for variants, patients, experimental assays, functional assays. And there are times where we have to search through tons and tons of literature to maybe find a handful of papers that we can actually curate and apply to our specific curations. So again, that time consuming. What's the other part? Keyword searches are not ideal, right? There's lack of consistent nomenclature. We all know that, or use of identifiers. Gene transcripts and gene names have changed. We know that the way that we give that transcript with HGDS nomenclature also shifts and changes as we get more and more data about where the start and stop of certain genes are. And so this also adds some complexity and difficulty when we think of searching. So overall, we all know, but it's best to reiterate, if we can't find the data that we need, this can result in valuable data being missed. And when we think about these gene disease relationships or variant pathogenicity and classifications, this could lead to inaccurate classifications and can have severe downstream effects on patient care. If we're missing a piece of data that goes from VUS to a likely pathogenic, that's really critical data for that patient, and that could affect their downstream treatment, especially if there are gene therapies for their specific variation. Well, here's those standard search platforms. Now, there could be other ones that you all use, but these are the standard ones that typically we go through. That's going to be good old PubMed that has a lot of scientific literature and millions of papers. We'll also use LitVar, which has now been put out as part of the NIH and supplementing a little bit of literature like ClinVar. We also have Mastermind and some other proprietary search engines that can use, but they come at a cost. And then we can have good old Google or Google Scholar, but we know that that's searching a hugely vast amount of literature and can have a lot of results come back. So again, when we're searching for that evidence, it does require several search streams and synonyms, right, in order to get meaningful results. We also know that many of these open access biomedical literature platforms don't search the supplement. So again, this is another area where we're potentially missing information unless we go through and read an entire paper and read through the supplement. Also, when we think about those proprietary subscription services that can search the supplement, they come at extremely high costs that are not a viable option for many. So really, again, what can we do? Well, I'd have an example here at the bottom of a typical search string that a curator would use in PubMed. This is actually what is recommended in our variant curation SOP. So now let's think that we take this search string, right? And let's go put it into PubMed. What do we get? Well, no surprise, we get 0 results. And I'm sure that most of you end up with this same issue if you go through PubMed. Again, it's because oftentimes the variant and its nomenclature is not indicated within the title and or an abstract or keywords. It might be buried within the text that's not searched, or that all worrisome supplement that is definitely not searched. Well, let's one up this. Let's go to another search string. Well, let's try LitVar, right? LitVar is an example of a search where they're trying to use some variant identifiers in order to annotate literature and be able to bring back search results. And so in this case, they use dbSNP or refseqs. So if we put in part of this, we got 1 result back. So that's great. We're getting somewhere better than none. And we're also honing in on our specific variant of interest that we have. Now, let's think about if we had a pre-annotated set of literature from individuals. And what would be the ideal way that you could search for evidence? So if you all want to put any kind of things in the chat, you can think of what is a way that you would like to be able to go in and search for evidence and get results back in a very high throughput and fast manner. No givers, no takers. Let's go through. Well, what if you could search the evidence using standardized tags, like stable variant IDs, that you know are going to cover all of the different ways that a variant is annotated? This may make identifying evidence easier, more streamlined, and it could save time. It will improve the efficiency and could positively impact patient care. And what if the search provided a link to take you directly to the text within the paper where that variant was mentioned or that case report? Well, I hope this is now web-based annotation. This is exactly what we can do with Hypothesis. With this web annotation tool, we can come through and standardize and structure data. We can also provide tags that we can search for that data. So if any of this literature has been pre-annotated and it has identified a specific variant or type of evidence, we can now provide a structured tag for that so that individuals can come through and use this as an additional type of tool like a PubMed or a LitVar or any of those other searches, and know within seconds whether or not there is annotated information on this paper. So I hope my sales pitch worked for you. I hope you all are really interested in what we can have for web-assisted annotation. And I'm going to go through and just allow you to see what this tool can do. And we'll also do some live demos for it. And so when we think about now that same variant that we had and we've been looking at and we had no results on PubMed, and then we went through and we had one result on LitVar, we've now put in the stable ClinVar ID for that variant. And of course, you saw from the search string how many different ways this variant could have been annotated or had synonyms or been named at some time. We already know that there are 5 matching annotations here. So just being able to come through Hypothesis' dashboard that they have to use, we can come and click on that first hit, mass spectrometry. That's going to open up and it's going to tell you exactly what's been annotated. This annotation can include demographics, and all importantly, it can have that variant or variants of interest. In this case, because it is looking at GAA and Pompe disease, which is an autosomal recessive or biallelic condition, there are actually 2 variants here, and they happen to be a compound heterozygous rather than a homozygous with the same variant. So again, another additional factor to Hypothesis in structure and standardizing the data that you are capturing when you are reading it. Not only will you get the variant of interest that you have in the information, but if they have an additional variant, you're going to see that as well. Not only that, if you click over here on Visit Annotations in the Context, as long as it's an open access article and you have the access to it, you will go ahead and get taken to that PMID paper. As long as you have a Hypothesis user ID and you are allowed or an affiliate of that particular group, it will then open up a cell or the Hypothesis app, and it will take you directly to that particular annotation within the paper. Again, you can see some highlights here because that means there's an annotation linked to that text. So imagine now, instead of just going to that PMID, having to read through all of it, find where that variant's listed, read all of that data again, it is all consolidated in one area because as you're reading or as someone else was reading this paper, they began to capture the data and the evidence that is applicable and or required for ClinGen curations. So this is what led to the launch of the baseline annotation within the ClinGen Community Curation Working Group. We launched this actually, just this past year in 2021 in April. And we've been beginning to get individuals who have interest in actually participating and contributing with ClinGen, as you heard yesterday from our contributors' perspectives. But obviously we know that there's a huge amount of interested individuals that can't necessarily participate on our expert panels or calls just because their time zones are conflicting with their time. And so this baseline annotation was really a way to help our expert panels, but also get contributions from them. But just because we have this baseline annotation with volunteers does not mean that you yourself right now as a curator or an expert or anyone within your expert panel could not use this tool as well. And so again, that purpose of baseline annotation was to give a curation process that involves annotating that biomedical literature in a standardized form so we can support the work of ClinGen expert panels. And again, this will utilize this open access web annotation tool, and we hope that it will improve, and I will actually show you that it will improve efficiency, data transparency, and evidence discovery. So you all may say, well, this seems great. How do we know it really saves time? Well, we did an experiment. We did a time trial, and we went through and had individuals pre-annotate literature. When we think about variant curation, I'll go and I'll show you Gene later, but we took individuals who would pre-annotate literature. We took 2 genes, GAA and MYH7. They had to look through literature that spanned a 2-year time point, and then go ahead and annotate that structured data, looking at that case demographics, looking at what are the variants associated, whether there's family information, et cetera. And then we went and assigned some of these variants off to our biocurators. They would have to either curate without using Hypothesis as one of the tools for them to come back with information. So again, they had to go through ClinVar, PubMed, Google, LitVar, Mastermind, and look through all those pieces of evidence and then list what are PMIDs they thought would be important, have the variant that they were assigned. Then they had to go through and use that with Hypothesis. And you can see that there is a significant amount of time savings that is here, anywhere on the order of, in some areas, 50 minutes per variant versus 20 minutes per variant. Obviously, that just depends on the type of variant and the information you have back. But again, at any point, even 5 minutes, when you couple that over several different papers and variants in time, this can save an exceptional amount of work. You all know that there are 15,000 genes associated with disease, and ClinVar just reported its 1 millionth variant within their database. So again, seconds and minutes add up exceptionally to the work that we're trying to do. Not that we're trying to go back and curate 1 million variants, but you understand even a fraction of that will be important. Why does it save time? Well, the tags that we use on these different structured and standardized annotations correlate to evidence codes. For the community curators, we have them only giving certain evidence type tags to be based on what the assertion was by the author. But you can see that these will correlate with pathogenicity criteria and categories within the ACMG's variant interpretation guidelines. We don't have them put these on themselves because they have to read and understand your guidelines. And if we want to build this repository and database ahead of time with genes while others are actually specifying, this just makes it easier. But again, when we think of inheritance pattern, that may apply to PS2, PM6, PM3. So just having this tag may tell you where you can have applied rules on ACMG. Again, when we think about segregation in PP1 and BS4, this now can go to the tag family information. So we provide those tags to let you know how they correlate back to different criteria so that you can search on them and look for that evidence. Again, lastly, we have experimental assay for functional assays that may let you know that the paper that's annotated could apply to PS3 or BS3. And then there can be additional annotation to capture data that we'll talk about as the future and current aspect that's going on right now in ClinGen. What are those tags? Well, we also developed additional standardized tags to support the systematic searches. So again, we'll put in a tag like disease entity here. So it will indicate based on an acronym for those diseases, what was the assertion in the paper. This is really important if any of you attended the lumping and splitting workshop that I gave yesterday. We know genes are associated with multiple disease entities. So knowing if one variant is overlapping in different disease entities, that will flag us whether or not there's a lumping and splitting issue. Again, we talked about supplemental data. This is that tricky area where we can't ever find papers for search, and that takes a lot of time because we'll have to go through that supplement. Well, we have a tag that will let you know as someone searching these annotations that you need to look in the supplement. This is where it's found, and we can still annotate on that paper. Now, will it have the link to the data like the other ones do? No, but the fact you can search on it and you know it's in the supplement and all of the case demographics data is collated together in one annotation, I think is still a valuable plus. And again, you can see those inheritance patterns, experimental assay, and most and all importantly, those IDs, ClinVar IDs and CA or the ClinGen allele or canonical allele ID. These will be tagged when they are known on any of these annotations here. And so this gives that high throughput search that you can come back, enter in that variant ID if you're interested, and find out if there's any pre-annotated information. Now, what's the other beauty of this? Well, with Hypothesis web-assisted annotation, not only, hopefully I convinced you that you can search, standardize, and structure your data, it can improve the efficiency and time, but it also allows that great conversation to happen just like Google Docs does. You can come through and reply to any annotation here, give a note to the individual, but this can also be used to validate the data, share your ideas, give different interpretations on that data. So again, the annotation aspect of adding additional context. This is also great for a teaching medium when we think about we have new users coming to annotation that we can help them. This creates a link specifically to this annotation, and it sends an email directly to that user with that link. So they click it and they come right back to this annotation and they know exactly what you're talking about. They don't have to sift and search through like you would with a Google Doc, or potentially with a Google Doc. So we do have protocols for annotation for baseline. It is located on the clinicalgenome.org website. If you go under curation activities, you will see baseline as one of the newest activities. So we have 6 now from the traditional 5. And if you go to that webpage to training materials, there are materials there. These materials are geared towards our baseline annotation for volunteers, but that does not prevent you from going and using this data within your specific VSEP, or even you yourself for anything else that you're doing within your job or day-to-day life. This will give an overview of how to annotate. It will also give you an example of the protocol and template for taggings that we provide, and we'll go through that in a little more detail. We also have some different tutorials there. So this is for variant, and hopefully I convinced you that this can save time and be a really useful thing, whether or not you're going to annotate yourselves, or if you can implore or encourage your VSEPs to say, let's try to open up some annotation with our volunteers in our community to annotate for our genes of interest. But now let's think about another way that this can save time, and we're going to go through a journey on gene curation. So let's think about it for all you gene curators out there. What's the typical process? Well, you go and you do your literature search, go to PubMed, Google, everything else. You try to triage and find those applicable papers as you read through the abstracts of them, highlight them, get your stack of papers. What's the next thing? Well, now you need to read the paper for the content. This is really to verify a step to ensure that there's applicable evidence to curate and that you have an understanding of that data. So you've now read through the data once so that you understand, yes, this is good. But now you need to go and enter that evidence in the gene curation interface. And what happens? Well, we put in our gene disease mode of inheritance and we put in our PMID, and the first thing that we're left with is saying we need to curate the group, the family, or the individual. And we often have to reread the paper again, right? To find the evidence, find all that data, capture it, and put it into the GCI, those demographics. What is that variant ID? So that might be fine if the paper only has 1 proband or 1 case report, but what happens when there are 5, 10, 20 probands to curate within this paper? Again, this adds up to time. So is there any part in this process where we can really cut this down and where annotation can help? And so we did another time trial with Gene, and we used this web-based annotation with Hypothesis to determine its usability, those advantages and disadvantages, and can that annotation cut down on any of those steps? We created a standardized SOP for this, specifically for Gene. It's different than what we just reviewed for the variant and merged variant and Gene. And in effect, this SOP organizes and directs the curator to annotate the pertinent information required for the entry in the GCI as you are reading the article. So we're going to see in some of these whether or not it saves time or not and where the time is saved. So when we did this, we picked 6 genes. We picked well-known definitive gene disease curations. And again, very similar to the variant, but this is one individual, actually 2 curators. And I think my colleague is on this call right now, Jen McGlon, who helped me to do this. We sat there, and in one of the genes, we went to either annotate it with Hypothesis, or we did not annotate, and we just did a full curation, as you saw, using that timeline. And then we compared between each other what was our time savings. We both knew that we can curate papers in about the same amount of time on average. And what we found is that we saved about 35 minutes per curation on average by using Hypothesis. Where is this time savings? Well, when we cut this down even to per article for how many articles we read, we saved about 6 minutes per article. So again, you can see that this is a significant time savings. And while 6 minutes seems little, when you know there are potentially 20 papers that you have to read and curate on for a particular gene-disease relationship, and it does happen, that leads to 120 minutes. We are now at 2 hours of time savings that you have acquired there. That's already 1/4 of another curation, or, potentially more curations. And again, when we bring that down to how many units we curated, when we think about the data we did, again, it was still about 5 minutes per unit. And this was statistically significant. And so these times savings add up over and over again. Again, why was this useful? Because we were directing, as you were reading the article, the evidence that you needed to capture to enter into the GCI. This standardized SOP that's available on the ClinGen website, and I'll show you where it goes through each piece of evidence that's required for gene curation. You'll see, and all of you know, you have to start with a gene, disease, and mode of inheritance. You have it right on the paper as you start, and it's logged there and structured, so you can just copy and paste those right into the GCI. And each part of this process is there. There's group information, family tag, annotations, there's case level, case control, all the way down to the experimental. And that's what we can see here. So each part is standardized. Each one of these areas are where you need to enter data into the GCI. So it was completely a coordinated effort. Now, when we think about that tagging in action, you come to a paper that you have of interest. For the title, you highlight it. And again, here's that information, PMID, you have the disease or mondo, and you have that gene. Copy and paste, plug and chug that in the GCI, you're on your way, but you're also providing that context directly on the paper. So if any other user comes to this and they have access to your specific hypothesis webpage, they can see this information. That plug and chug, here it goes, right? We know these are the information that needs to be required. It's already right here and annotated. Again, you can see these other areas. So while you will spend more time reading the paper because you are annotating at the same time, the savings that you have on the back end for entering the data in the GCI is so significant, you're still saving time. So you may have to take a little bit of time at first to learn this process, learn about structuring and standardizing data, but this is proof now you will save time in the end. So I hope I still convince you how important this may be for you all to use. And not only that, we talked about that interactive curation process, right? We can start a discussion, we can train, we can validate data, we can provide feedback. If you think of these ever going public in the future, this can provide, the author to this paper when you're curating to come back and say, oh, you're right, I did forget this. Here's that additional information, right? Another layer of information and annotation that's providing context to this paper. We all know that we are limited by the number of words we can put in papers, and it's quite unfortunate. That means a lot of things need to be cut that are really important for back-end types of things like ClinGen's data. And so this could also provide that extra information in the future. That ClinGen Gene Annotation SOP is available on our ClinGen website. In this instance, you want to go to Curation Activities and you want to go to Gene Disease Clinical Validity Training Materials. The all important, if you all do not know this, it will show you default the training modules. Click over to that additional supporting materials. We have tons of things here, including that hypothesis annotation SOP. So don't forget about this separate tab. Come look here. There's also many other pieces of text, as well as our old SOPs if you ever need to look at those there. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the current and the future work that we are doing using Hypothesis, and then I'll go through and kind of show you Hypothesis and start looking at the chat to answer any questions that you have. And so we do have 2 pilot groups that have been established of ClinGen contributors and volunteers that chose our baseline annotation. These annotators will build a repository of annotations over the genes for these 2 VSIPs. And this will allow, hopefully, for more streamlining and enhanced training protocols. We want to use this and have used this within some of our ClinGen areas. We've used it for our UNC Biocuration and Coordination Core exclusively with undergrads and training them. It also has been used within the VHL VSEP as a pilot. And so this will help us to create even more refined training protocols. Again, we generated these with several different VSEPs. This is not the only ones, but I do want to plug the VHL VSEP with Safa and Sar. She's going to present a poster on what they did with hypothesis annotation within this VSEP following the break that we have and at the poster session. So I encourage you all to go not only to see all our posters, but if you're interested even more about time savings and just how you train individuals on this, go see Safa's paper. And again, we have an annotation protocol that has been developed for variant functional assay criteria for PS3 and BS3 that was developed by Bradford Powell and Donna Canavi as part of the ClinGen efforts, and you'll start hearing about that more and more. And future possibilities, I know you all have been wondering about this the whole time I've been talking, which might be like a half hour or 45 minutes now, but will this get to the GCI? We are thinking about this. Don't worry. We know that this could be something very positive. And so we have been working with the Stanford team to think about how we can have integration of annotations on the GCI and the VCI. Again, we will look at how we can highlight these. Here is an example of a mock-up where we can go and show you within the VCI that there are community annotations from our baseline annotators, and they may provide those links that take you out either to the PubMed or directly to that paper or annotation. So when you enter in that variant, you may know that there's already some annotations on it. If your group decides to have annotations built for it, you'd also have the ability to go through that hypothesis dashboard that we have now. But certainly for those who do not, and we know the VCI is open to several other individuals that are outside of ClinGen, this may be another useful, more transparent, enhanced data. Also, we do hope to develop protocols for other curation efforts. When we think about the fact that we are standardizing data, that could be useful across all our curation activities. So when we think of dosage as we're bringing on those CACN IDs and copy number variant IDs, that's something else that could potentially be tagged in papers to bring back for that effort. And in actionability, again, you're looking at some different areas like penetrance that might be useful that we can capture. And then lastly, we want to engage more of the public to annotate. It really is something where if we can get down to keywords that are really important for our evidence, can we provide a way for citizen scientists to come into ClinGen and be able to contribute? And so that is the end of this, and we'll go through a demonstration, and then I will go ahead and also look at the chat. Stop my share, and then I will share my screen for hopefully the right screen. Yay. And thank you, Deb, for putting the links to those materials in the chat. I really appreciate that. If you all have any other questions, please begin to add them in there. What I want to show you real quickly is just hypothesis. This is the dashboard that we were talking about, but if any of you are interested, you can go to just the web.hypothesis. I'll put that into the chat really quickly, hopefully. Here you can come down on hypothesis. You can read more about it, what it's used in action. You can
Courtney, it's a little bit, the screen we're seeing is kind of off center, at least it is for me. Are others seeing that?
Is it over here better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, I moved it from one screen to the other, so I'll move it back. Thank you so much, Deb.
Sure.
As you all can imagine, during the pandemic, when now kids were coming back from school, this really took off in an education area, again, a way for individuals to have conversations and interact when they could not do that in person. So definitely take a look at this hypothesis. If you scroll down, it tells you about how you can get started. It can show you how it works. You can come over to this specific area on Get Started, and you can sign up to annotate. It is free for anyone. What you would need to do is download the hypothesis application to your web browser. It works the best on a Chrome extension. So when you think of Google Chrome or even Microsoft Edge, Bravo, anything that's a Chromium-based web browser, it's going to work on best. In the absence of that, they do have a bookmarklet that's over here you can also use in addition. Once you do that, you will see that you will have this additional application in your web browser that I'm circling here. It's the little icon for the H When it's grayed, it means that it's inactive. We'll show you what it looks like when it's active. The neat part is that that little blue bubble with 54 lets you know that there are 54 annotations on this specific page. You can see this module here, which downloads, and you can collapse or you can expand. And if I go here, I have a lot of groups, so bear with me, to the public, you can start to see all those annotations. What's awesome is that, see the words here, that means that's what's highlighted. It takes you to where it is in the text, and those people provide the extra context to the data or the annotation here. So this is where we get the power of that tool. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that, and I'm just going to log in so you can see a little bit about the annotations that we have. So when you come in and you sign in as a user, it will show you all of the annotations you have done personally. So that already gives you one area to look through annotations. So mine, I've collected 2,400 annotations in what I've done myself, but this is a great way to look. You can use the search much like a search bar, but if you do things in a standardized way using those camel case text, as you saw that we had, you can standardize what you bring back for a search. You can also create groups. So this is things that we have done for some of our different curation groups here. I'm going to head on over to the ClinGen von Willebrand factor annotation. What you can do is see that you can provide a new link for members. You send that to individuals. They have to have a Hypothesis sign up to be a member, but you have all members there. So very much like we have our expert panels or affiliations that you might hear of in the GCI and the VCI, you can also create those same affiliations within Hypothesis. I hope you begin to see the beauty of what happens when you start pre-annotating literature for your different variants of significance. On the side, right side, you'll see those top 50 tags. This is not all of the tags. This is just the top 50 that are used here, but you're going to start to see those inheritance patterns and CAIDs that are really useful. This also has an API on the back end. So when you think about, well, we're entering all this data, how can we extract it? Well, they have an API to do that. So those of you who are really savvy with data and extracting data, you can look more on Hypothesis website and their blogs and GitHub to be able to figure out their API. There's also a facet that was developed by the scientific or director of scientific integrations that allows you to get an Excel or a CSV sheet out with some of that data from the API in just a high throughput manner. Again, when we think about these different things, you can look at the paper itself to see what is annotated here on each one of this data. And again, giving you a little bit of an idea, but what's great is coming around here. If I knew that I had a particular variant that I was assigned and I needed to go and look at evidence, I can simply type in that specific variant ID, whether it's a CAID or ClinVar. I will let you know that for our community volunteers, we have them preference and preferentially type in a ClinVar ID if there is one. We felt that that was very useful to the VSEPs and even GSEPs to know that there is some type of entry in ClinVar and could indicate that there's a pathogenicity interpretation already. In the absence of having a ClinVar ID, we have our ClinGen allele registry and canonical allele IDs. So that will already let you know if there's a CAID here that this likely does not have a ClinVar entry anymore. So you know you're curating a variant that hasn't already had an interpretation. What you see is that you already have the listed information here for that particular variant. You can see the data that was captured in a structured way and those tags that help to power this search that we have here. What's great is that if there are any other variants that are asserted, those would also be tagged within here. Some of them are going to have nomad data and provide you those links. So everything you needed in a high throughput manner to search is here. It doesn't prevent you to go back to that paper itself and to look for it. And as long as that data was open access, you would be able to visit the annotations in that context. For this particular one, I didn't double check, so it might be a bag, but lucky us, this is a PubMed ID. I will let you know for our baseline annotators, we have geared them towards PubMed Central and open access articles only. Now, what you do within your VSEP, you may have additional information and people highlighting and curating information that might have a little bit more close access to them only. And that's okay. They're still providing that data and they were the individual who had the access to that data. So again, this takes us right to that information. If you want to see all of the information, you would just say show all, and you will see any other data that we have here. Interesting enough, You will notice, why is this showing 75 page notes here? That's because these have supplemental data. And we can see that even from the tag here that we have supplemental data. So this already gives you an indication when you narrow down into this variant and you look at all the tags that are applied to this paper, the number of different variants that have been tagged here, as well as whether or not they're supplemental data. If there was family information, we'd have that tag, and etc. So again, you're going to know that information is there. It won't be an annotation. It will not be able to link it to the text like these do, but it will be a page note that's included there. The annotation itself is here for that title. So that information's stored, which is great. You're able to know that it's the supplement. If I come back over really quickly, just to give you an example, we do have some standardized text that we do use in templates across all of the VSEPs and GSEPs for what data you need to capture, but that does not prevent you from potentially adding additional tags to that. So I want to give you a little bit of an example here from the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy annotations. This is one of them that we are launching within the baseline annotators. And so they will slowly be accumulating more and more information on the 7 genes that are covered within this particular VSEP. So I know that I have a specific PMID of interest. I go ahead and enter that in the structured way, PMID : and then the actual ID, and I push enter. This should now, again, restrict my results to tell me whether or not something's here and annotated. If nothing shows up, that PMID hasn't been annotated yet. You can move on with your work and keep reading that paper, annotate yourself in this, or to use it and curate. But what I can want to show you here is if, again, we visit this context here, we can begin to see the additional criteria that we're adding to this particular variant curation process. So it brings you to the paper again. The cell will open. We'll see that annotation here. We can show all of them. And now I can move down. Now this is great, right? I'm at the top of the screen. I'm at the title, but I want to know what they're talking about. Click this area or even that cell, and it takes you directly to that case in the paper so you know where they're accumulating the data. What you can see is that there's a significant amount of demographics, HPO terms here, what was their testing, but you can see that other things that were important to this variant curation expert panel, we're looking at motor achievement, if that was achieved, what age that was achieved, what were the creatine kinase levels. Those could also be added as additional tags that makes it easier for you as a VSEP to pull out this information. When you think about you need to do your phenotyping tags, you can think about those different phenotypes. And I'll show you an example of another VSEP where that was done. This is all powered by these tags here to let us know these different levels. So again, CK level intermediate, and you all can provide the definitions of when a tag is used and when it's appropriate. I'm going to head on over to a different group now, to the ACAD-VL annotations, just to show you another example of how they were able to use the annotation and add some additional tags to find more group information here. So what was great about this is they had one individual who was doing an undergraduate thesis come through and really want to look about the phenotype and enzyme activities. You can begin to see some of those tags as they have here and looking at where an enzyme activity was below or above 20%, which was a cutoff specified in their piloting rules. So if I go to look at this particular PMID and I'm really excited about what's going on here, not only here can I see that information, but I can see how those enzyme activities were, right? The range was less than 20%, and you can get any of the additional information that you want. And again, because it has that link, and this happens to be an open access article, I push that link in context. It's taking me directly to the page and the article. So I, as a person, can say, well, I don't really know this individual is an annotator, they're new, but I want to see where they got that data. It's right here, it's in this table. This is another enhancement, right? You can annotate tables, you can annotate charts, you can annotate words in this text. These are things that we can't always capture when it's in the GCI, except for saying a word, it's in the table. So this is a really great, useful tool. And then you can come and read it. And I can say, I don't know you. So I'm going to read through and I'm going to fact check and I'm going to validate this information. But imagine once you validate people's information so many times, you begin to trust them, right? You know that they're doing this appropriately. You're providing training back to them, which is essentially what we want to do. This provides a training opportunity for expert panel members to give to other individuals who are contributing to the curation efforts. And that provides a mentorship kind of capacity there. And so again, just getting into some more of that data. I'm going to go over to the VHL annotations that we have and have been developing, because this is an interesting aspect of Hypothesis and where they've really been able to modify that template to fit their needs because of the fact that VHL is in the cancer space and they also curate not in our VCI that's developed by ClinGen, but in Civic. And so because of their efforts, they do need to have a few additional information to that. And Hypothesis has allowed them to do that. You can see they can capture all that same information, but they can also capture the evidence statements that are really required for their particular entity. They've given out some different additional tags, again, that could be options for any group to do, like mutation germline. Well, VHL also has somatic variation. This is where we can get and helping with somatic curations too, right? And we can separate and segregate to know where does it go to our germline specifications versus the somatic, because those may be different. And that's a really useful tool to have as a tag as you're entering information. I just want to give you an idea, when you look at those different tags here, you can begin to see whether or not there's information here. And so again, they have some really nice examples of family pedigrees or family info. So I'm taking you to this specific PMID to say, I really have interest of this, take it there. But you can also begin to understand what are the other types of information that are included. And so here we can see the annotations coming up. And if I show all, we can be taken directly to the part of that text. What's nice is this is going back through a pedigree here. And so some of this information is going to tell you exactly about that. And it's going to indicate that there's family information here. And when you know you have that specific tag, you can look for family info itself, and you can even use your variant ID and add the family info to really say, I want to see if there's segregation. And once you get to that, you can see whatever they've annotated on that specific case, and it may direct you to a different area or a figure within that paper. And so again, what's really nice, and I hope I've kind of emphasized, please ask any questions. Oh, I see Libba says, is there any way to capture validation information so that particular annotators gain trusted status? That's great. So one of the things we're trying to develop is when we give a reply to the annotation, we provide a way to say fact check data validated, right? So I can come here and say, I've read all of this. I can add a tag that this was a validated piece of information. And then again, on that API, you should be able to come back and extract and see how many times their data was validated. And again, that will give you more gained trust. We are also hoping to implement within phase 3 a little bit more of a streamlined method where we can give a thumbs up or thumbs down, much like Reddit. So not only us as annotators, but if we make these out to the public or the other annotators, there can be this constant loop of fact checking. So you can think of it like a Reddit. You go and read it, the people who have the most thumbs up are validating the data, there could be thumbs down, and you kind of have a statistical value there. Ultimately, we would still say, you know, read over it if you have any lack of trust in what the data is, but most of the time you begin to know people are taking things seriously. Even of us ourselves, right? We can make mistakes. We can miss HPOs. We just did a test of this with undergrads for a week to teach them annotation, and even them pulled out an HPO ID that a biocurator had not found within HPO. And that's just because these resources are being updated all the time. So it's really great that we have this iterative process where we can discuss and talk about it. What's also great is that this annotation, again, if you come here, has a link. So if you have a question about this annotation, you can copy this link and send it in an email. If you want to talk because you don't have this person's email, you can just send the reply. It will send it straight to their email. It gives that link, and that starts the conversation back and forth between these annotations. So I hope that answered your question. Lula, and that was a really great question. So yeah, these are those different types of tags that you can look at. So I'm going to head on over to the ITG A2B and B3 with the platelet disorders. And again, just giving you an idea of what they've used. This group actually has the entirety of literature for ITG A2B and B3 annotated now. So this is the ultimate of where we would want to get. That might not be the case for every type of gene. When we think of very well-known gene-disease relationships or just certain domains like MYH7 for cardiovascular or NF2, that would be thousands and thousands of papers. But if individuals are interested and they keep curating, we can keep getting up to this data. Certainly those that are more rare, you could have the ability to annotate all of the data that's in that repository. What was fabulous about this is that the experts had indicated at some point that every variation was just new. There weren't variants that were actually seen or observed in more than one people. And they thought that they couldn't apply certain variant rules for there. It just wouldn't work. Well, having the entirety of the literature annotated for a gene with structured IDs for the variant is very useful. So as you see here, I'm going to type in a specific CAID. And what do I find? There are 3 different annotations from 3 different papers. That means that these could be potentially 3 independent people who have this specific variant. So it does mean that it can occur in different individuals, and it means that we can find additional code. Now, obviously, you'd want to know that these are not the same person, but we do also have tags like previously published, and those individuals would put the information here with the PMID they were published in. And again, it creates that feedback loop where you can begin to see where data is equivalent. And if you've already annotated that paper, you can use that same little nifty tag that we went through on that annotation, and you can drop that in your new annotation. So not only do you say is exactly the same, they're already annotated, here's the data, and you have the link to take you directly to that annotation. So again, increasing that transparency. And then I want to give you one last example while we're working through here of how this is going to work for gene curation. So I'm going to pop on over to the ID Autism expert panel. I was part of this expert panel, and we started our own little annotation for individuals who wanted to annotate. And so one example that I want to give you is the fact that you don't have to be restricted to annotating just a scientific article. You can actually annotate more articles than just that. And that was the case when I went into a specific gene, ZNF292. So we went through, and you can see there are 22 annotations. The entirety of this curation was annotated for its very first initial curation. Now, there could be additional information now if it's been recurated. But what you can start to see and appreciate here is that there's an annotation that doesn't look like a PDF. It doesn't look like it's an article. It says My Gene 2, and that's exactly what it is. I would encourage you all as biocurators to look beyond the bounds of the scientific article, especially when you're on variant, but still consider it on gene, because this can bring additional information that's really useful for your expert panel to know. I know we can't necessarily include unpublished data at this time. That's really up to your group. If it is something where there are 6 people in My Gene and they are not listed in publications, and that can change the classification, and you can annotate and you have a web address that's stable for those individuals, there's no reason why you shouldn't bring that data back to your expert panel. And that's exactly what I did. I said, here is this individual, it's in My Gene 2. And you can see the richness of data because they have all of the HPO terms for this individual and what they have. And it was really great. And if you think that this person has been published, you can also put that information here. So it's not limited to just those scientific articles. You can go out to ClinVar and annotate it. You can annotate external databases like LOVD, or if there's one for your gene. You can also look at these places like My Gene 2. Another really good example that came from this group as well. Somebody annotated or curated a paper. Maybe you all have had this. And this curation is up for recuration, and you don't happen to be part of the group or performing that curation anymore. What are you going to do when the person reaches out and goes, well, I noticed in your original curation for this paper, you didn't include this case report. How many of you, by show of hands, are going to remember that paper and that case report if it's been 2 or 3 years behind it? Give a thumbs up if you do remember, give a thumbs down if you don't. I'm guessing there's going to be some thumbs down. That was the case for me. I didn't quite remember, but because I had annotation and I had hypothesis, I went through and I put that specific PMID in that gene. I pulled it up and I said, oh, well, I didn't annotate that paper because the deletion includes more than just that gene. We know that we can have intragenic deletions when they are only contained within one gene that can be scored on gene disease validity, but we can't have it when it's beyond that. And I was able to go quickly back to my notes. I didn't have to reread this paper. I didn't have to think about what it was or jog my brain. That note, that critical annotation and note of why I did not include this data was right there in this annotation. Now, we have brought on this process into the GCI. You do have the ability to add a PMID and say why you did or did not include it in the curation, which is great. And it came from this whole premise of hypothesis being able to do that. The same happened on this paper. I was brought to this paper. Why did you not include this specific case? Why did you not score this case in your original curation? And I was able to go back directly to that paper. I was able to pull up the annotations that we had here. And I went right down to that case. And I said, well, case 5, I didn't, again, because the breakpoints now include parts of another gene in microRNAs, and we just didn't feel it was suitable. And then I may have a limitation that I cannot assign this particular allele in the registry at the time. And that might evolve and change, but that information at that time and date, because it says January 23rd, 2019 and captures the provenance, is there. Great, and that's kind of all I have for you right now for the annotation, but I'm happy to take any questions or to go through any other examples of annotation for you all.
Courtney, do we need to put the questions in the chat, or is it okay to just, discuss them here?
Yeah, it's okay to discuss. You
Great.
all can unmute yourself, so we can have an open discussion.
Great. Yeah. So I wanted to ask a question and maybe to have Safa comment on this about how translatable are the protocols. So for instance, the VHL VSEP has spent the group of students working with the VHL VSEP on hypothesis has spent a fair amount of time creating that protocol. And if we wanted other cancer groups to use it, how easy would it be to like modify, transfer, et cetera?
Yeah, and I can take a stab and then Safa can tell you, but she used what was the template we created in the C3 for it and was able to adapt it. And we certainly had this as an iterative process to think of what was useful for them and what was useful for us. And so if you go even to the training materials here and the overview, you get a little bit of an idea of this template review that we have and bringing it up. So there are certain tags that we would always want individuals to have in general, because again, those variant IDs can that be followed, but you can certainly add additional ones there. So there will always be a case or an article information annotation, and we would always want to have the PMID, the gene, and the HDNC ID captured there, right? That allows that power of the search in those tags. And certainly because we know there's information that's useful for us to capture consistently across ClinGen when we think of what are those presenting phenotypes, family information, those would be the same. And then the tags, really, you create almost like a cheat sheet of tags that you want to use. This is exactly what it is. You can copy and paste and put it into your hypothesis browser. That's one of the things, like even if I copied this now, I can go over to any of the texts that we have here. I can highlight it because I'm annotating, hopefully. Of course, now this doesn't want to work, but once you have your hypothesis working, you would highlight text just as you would normally. It will open a cell to tell you whether you want to annotate or highlight here. So I can say annotate. And then that opens the module. For the tag that you saw me just copy, I paste it in there and I would say enter. And then you can post to ClinGen, you can post to the public, you can post to yourself, and then only you would see it. And that's exactly how simple it is to to annotate. But this little cheat sheet here, you can expand. So again, those mutations, you can add zygosity if that's important. You can add those phenotypes and enzyme assays. So you can add additional ones. We have come up with different protocols for expert panels to say, you know, you have to make sure this is camel case, that there are no spaces within it, right? There's some structure. And I will tell you with the C3 and UNC grant, as we move forward into phase 3, we are going to be looking at building an actual application. So as you annotate and you highlight, it will give the standard tags to it. So again, in case there's a space or I copied this wrong or there's, misspelling, that would all be reduced as well. And I'll let Safa also talk.
The tags are going to be, some of the standard tags would be incorporated into like,
yes.
Okay, wonderful.
And
yeah,
then
I'd love to hear your thoughts on how easy it would be to, or what are the elements that would be needed to transfer this protocol?
Absolutely. So yeah, one thing that I certainly didn't work on it all on my own. This was a group effort. So Samantha and I spent quite a lot of time working with Courtney, and we definitely used this template that she had given us. So in terms of transferring elements of this template over to your own specific disease working group, of course, there are the tags, as Courtney said, that you need to have, but there's also a lot. I think it's very, very easy to, as you're going through papers, add whatever you think is needed based on, you know, the way papers are written or the way that cohorts are often presented within your disease working group. So for example, with VHL, one thing that we just added was a bunch of cohort IDs, because a lot of VHL papers report patients not as individual patients, but as groups of patients. And they're often grouped by disease presentation, or they're often grouped by, because VHL, of course, is a hereditary cancer, they're often grouped by tumor, specific tumors that they might have, or specific variants that they might have. So that was something that we were really easily able to add in. Another thing that, of course, we added in was civic information, because, of course, over the past few years, the VHL team has been uploading all of the VHL variants onto the civic database. And I see some civic people here as well today. So shouting out civic and all the work that they do for us. And so that's something that we were able to add in really easily as well. And so this protocol is very dynamic and versatile. And I think one of the best things about it is that when you're within a certain working group, whoever's on the expert panel, as long as they know what tags to use to search for specific information, even if those tags differ slightly between working groups, as long as you're within a specific working group, you'll be easily able to pull out all of that information as quickly as possible. And that's what we've tried to do with VHL. We've tried to make disease phenotype associations as easily searchable as possible, and to differentiate single patients from cohorts. So I think I think that it would be very easy to transfer over.
And I did not pay Safa to say that.
Great. No, I mean, we're interested too. I know for, like I said, we've had, Melissa Klein has, reached out about using Hypothesis as well in BRCA1, BRCA2, and getting some of that literature, doing some annotations for that as well. So great. It's great to know it could be, somewhat transferred over. We'd probably have to take out some of the civic specific elements if they weren't planning to put that literature into civic. But again, I don't know why they wouldn't, because it could then go into another open database.
And the nice thing is, again, because of that backend API and data, it could still be something where, are there certain things that go into the VCI? Are there certain things that go into Civic? There can be a harmonization, right, between the different data types, and where it could be incorporated in both, right? Not just one or the other. We can certainly push towards one, but, those are different things you can think about, right? As long as it's data. And as I said, these could eventually be posted to the public after they're fact checked and they're validated. Now you're enhancing the public's view of what they can see. As long as they are a registered Hypothesis user, they could see this additional type of information. So it really can just add, when we think about just a broader spectrum of going into the, the notes and the margin of these papers of how we interpret it. And this is just a specific view from looking at it in a clinical genomics perspective, right? Someone else could read these papers and take it from a patient standpoint, and they could annotate something totally differently on top of it. But it does just help define some of that literature that we like. Now, we hope in the future that we can still have more standardized IDs, like HPO codes being accepted and required for different journals, as well as variant IDs. And there's a push for that. But there's still 29 million articles in PubMed right now that don't have that. And so if you're already doing this type of information, it's useful. We can even think all the way into our ClinGen allele registry and LitVar, right? You're annotating on variants and you have a PMID associated with it. That alone is useful to say this article has information on this paper, whether they've used it for an annotation or not. That data is there. And you provide a way to validate where that data came from. So it certainly can be a much broader aspect than just helping with the curations that you have. And as I said, it is very adaptable. I mean, this tool was really just developed, again, to create links, even when you think of journalism and you're fact checking. Well, someone said this on this web page and went to that. But if you structure it, you can capture anything you want. I mean, I was surprised to hear people use this, as I said, for shopping and Christmas shopping. And I thought, oh, this is brilliant. If you have to buy for a lot of people and you're running through different websites, you're not going to remember where you went somewhere. You can just tag it and say, this is for this particular person's name and a birthday or a Christmas present. You can go looking at different places. If you're going on holiday, where do I want to go? I looked up all these websites and I looked up these restaurants or places to go. So it's a tool even beyond what I'm showing you here with ClinGen. So I hope if anything that you all took away from today, it's, using a web assisted annotation tool could be useful in multiple different facets of what you do.
Hi, Courtney. Great presentation, exciting work. And hi, everyone else. I'm Matt Wright from the VCI GCI team, in case you don't know who I am. So I'd just like to make a quick comment about the future potential of using Hypothesis that you mentioned. So we're working closely with Courtney's team to specify how your curations could be brought into the VCI and GCI. So for instance, we're looking into how we could potentially access your curations you've annotated into a paper in Hypothesis while you're working within the interfaces. And so, for instance, if you're in the GCI and you're adding in a family that you've annotated in Hypothesis, then we're looking to potentially, if you could have a copy function, for instance, for bringing these data directly from Hypothesis into the GCI. So that's our end goal that we're kind of working toward. And our team, that's myself and Rao Madavra, I think is on this session actually. And we're currently having regular meetings with Courtney's team to specify the requirements. So we're looking into what's available to us technically to see how easy that would be to implement. So a big thank you to you, Courtney, for driving this Hypothesis project forward, because I think it's a really, really useful thing for curators. And we're hoping for big things for this curation pipeline via Hypothesis in the future.
Yeah. And as we said, this is a secondary form of information. We know we all can have computer glitches. This was another way where you have all of that information captured here. So if your computer goes wonky one day, it's there. If you weren't able to get on the GCI, VCI one day, it's still there. You can still annotate, you can still curate, no matter what platforms or your computer or glitches you have. What's nice is you can stop and save. You don't have to wait for required parts. You can stop if you're, I've had to stop because my child comes in the middle of something. I stop and I save it, and then I just come right back and reread the paper. I don't forget it. So it really is useful in that context. And when we think about, even with NIH, or we have grants that you need to have 2 levels of your data saved, right? Well, here's another level, but it helps to really promote. And as Matt said, we're hoping that this can really have a lot of different integration and help for our curators as they want to use this different type of tool. It's really open. As Safa mentioned, there are some limitations to it, but it is getting better. People are trying to promote and using this and developing it all the time. It works best when you use an HTML. You can see I've used HTML. It can do PDF. It's not, the one thing you have to make sure though is that your URL is stable. And so, you can. I wanted
to ask about that with URLs, and about if it, like the article you have right now, is that ever going to change? Is that?
Yeah, that's one thing. Most of the time they're not changing, but you have a great point. If they change, it can cause some difficulties. Now, you will not ever lose what you annotated. It's here. It's in this database. You will see PMIDs associated. You can go back. But if the URL changes, occasionally it does often shift stuff. They've been working on it with Hypothesis to make that better. But if the reason why PDFs are hard is because a lot of journals, when you say get PDF version and it pops up a whole new web page, that typically means that they are generating that PDF on the fly with just any random URL that they are associating. So the best way to know is to go into that URL, copy, open up a different tab or a different link, paste it, and make sure that's stable. So I can't say it's an annotate. And especially when you think of old ones where all they have is like this PDF, you can try it. It has worked before. Examples in here where we maybe didn't annotate and have the links into the paper, but you could see the PDF old version and you just annotate as a page note. So those are the different ways that you can get around that. So yeah, there's always some kinds of limitations there. This is one of them because it is based on a web browser and a web URL. But in general, like with NCBI, they aren't changing these drastically. Now, if you're annotating from a journal's website, you can't guarantee that. They may change those, but you haven't lost the data. The data will still be here. You'll see everything that's annotated. The link between the data and the annotation may get lost.
Okay. There was another question from Jennifer about annotations made by people in other VSEPs and GSEPs. So is there an overarching ClinGen group where anyone in ClinGen could see the other annotations for people in ClinGen?
Great question. We don't have that at this time. They do have a functionality to have a large group or a federation, and that's what we're looking into. We just really need, you all to kind of figure out, do you want to use annotation if they're in your groups to use it? And then once we get a lot of feedback that way, we can move on to different steps. That would be great for us to get that federation so you can see. The great part is that on the back end for the data we're collecting, we can present that out as being super users. And so when we think about the VCI, even though you wouldn't see the access to the group's information here, you could still see the link and the information annotated because of the user's permissions on the back end of it. But we hope to have a little bit more access. Right now, we kind of ask people to use them in their closed private groups, but we really do hope that in the future, if this is used, these annotations can be posted to the public and then anyone can see them. And that means across GSEPs, across VSEPs, and across just other people who have interest in data science.
I want to ask another question. Sorry to have so many questions, but I'm really interested in it. So the one of the benefits I could see here would be feeding what we have annotated into machine learning tools. Are you exploring any uses for that? Like we had the MACE2K a presentation on the semantic call, and they particularly talked about how important it was to have the actual text from the paper highlighted. So they've done a lot of work on just using the associations of what curators have said about a paper versus having the actual text itself. So that was immediately I thought of Hypothesis.
Well, and it's interesting you say that because I worked with Subha Madhavan this last year to write a grant with the MACE2K. So I worked with her with Hypothesis, and that's exactly what we're doing. So within this next phase 3 of the grant, especially on, ClinGen is made up of different grants and structures, but, the UNC and Kaiser grant's going to move forward to try to do some machine learning. So just like you said, Deb, I think you all could see the power. This is what we call like a gold standard annotation when we think about that case report and what it says at the very end of it. But you can imagine that there are several pieces of data, even when we think about what are these HPOs, they can be highlighted, HPO something, right? And this is something that if we can do this as humans, to start with, we create a database of gold standards. Now think about how that can enhance machine learning and algorithms, right? This becomes a human validating and fact checking, but also providing information. So it's a total feedback loop to where we can potentially get to the point where those algorithms can start telling you we've triaged papers based on, we've looked at how many are applicable. We know here are the words that are, similar. We can also tell you if there's a variant. We can start to define in what are HPO IDs for that. And then you can use that to build these annotations themselves. So again, more time savings. I know it sounds great. It will take time to get there, but we really are positive about the human in the loop kind of area of machine learning, right? We know the value of humans and that we can compute things on a much higher and different level, but there are some standardized things that we can have a computer do for us. So right now we have community annotators annotating these things, right? But you can imagine in the future, we can have a computer do this, present information. And again, with that thumbs up, thumbs down approach, it can be validated by our community annotators. Yes, this is right. Or you missed something, I can add an additional annotation. And again, that feeds back to that machine learning loop so that it knows something that it missed. But we hope so in the future.
I'd love to hear a little bit from anyone on Civic. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but about incorporating Hypothesis into Civic is in kind of what are the plans for that, or is that already in process?
Yeah, this is Lana from Civic.
Lana?
Hi, yeah, Lana. We currently don't have, we haven't really talked too much, unless I haven't been part of those conversations about incorporating Hypothesis into Civic, but it seems somewhat similar or like harmonious with the Civic Mind project. And so maybe it'd be interesting to get you, Courtney, talking with Jake Lever, who's our data scientist for Civic Mind, which is also like a natural language processing algorithm that kind of looks for sentences, just single sentences, but this seems like much more in depth.
Yeah, because this can definitely get into like single sentence, single word, or multiple words. That's one thing that we've noticed on some things. It can take, several sentences to provide a context, but yeah.
Yeah, that several sentences thing is something that I know Jake has been having a bit of a hard time with, just like separating signal from noise. And so if Hypothesis is able to do that, and I think that could be really powerful for getting some of the first steps in curation handled on a much more programmatic way.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd definitely like to follow up with that. I know sometimes in the initial, when we were with VHL and others, they did have some discussions just thinking about Civic and what we can do. But again, knowing that there's an API on the back of Hypothesis, even if it's just individuals annotating this and, information, if it's in a structured way, is that, possible for there to be integration. But like I said, even at the end of the day, it's great if a computer can come pull this out and pre-populate the data within cells, but you literally just copy, paste, and put in. So we took something that when we were normally in the GCI would take us, maybe an hour to enter in the data. We literally got down to 2 to 5 minutes. And that was it, because we already annotated it here and we just copied and pasted it right into what we needed. Now on the front end, it took longer, but when you think about curation, where do you want your curator spending the most time? Not entering data, you want it on the data, reading it. So as I read this, it already tells you, start putting down, well, this is case 7. I put case 7, I put down, it's a girl. I know that. Let's look at these HPOs. I've got HPO opened in a different tab. I'm seeing there's difficulties in breastfeeding. Let's check that HPO. Let's do this. And I'm still contextualizing all of these different phenotypes, what they're doing, and I'm capturing that annotation as I go. And I keep reading through the paper and I can collate that information. So again, this is the gold standard. It's not highlighting each piece of information, but as I read through, I'm going to get down to where I see where this person's particular variant is. It's located in a different area, but it's in here in this information. So now I come and I would just copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste. And it just took so much fractions of time down, and I didn't have to read the paper a second time.
Yeah, that's super powerful to have like an assistant to reading, basically. And I think right now, curating HPO phenotypes on the somatic side is not something that is very widely practiced, just because of the the time intensity of it. And so if we were able to incorporate HPO phenotypes for the somatic aspects too, that I think would make our data so much more rich.
Yeah, and that's the one thing, you know, just if it's added there. If it's something programmatically you don't accept now, but that information's there, right? So when you think about, if you even want to gear the people using this to say, look up these HPOs, their time can be spent there and it's collected. And then it's the time of, where are we going to put this? How are we going to represent it? Whatever time that takes, that data will still be there, rather than saying, you know, forget about doing this data right now, just move past it, right? And then you have to go back. But even if you have to go back, you come back, you read this paper, you push this little button, you edit, and you edit all of the information that was there. So you change it, and then it will just give you a change of date. If you wanted to, you can give a reply and say, this is an update to a prior curation. I'm adding this additional information. Then that will give you a provenance of that date. But that's the great thing about Hypothesis, is it still captures a date, a time, and a provenance for a person here.
Could you clarify Deb Ritter's note that you could use tags for disease ontology and Mondo? So like, we'll also pull in DO terms and say like, this child has blank DO term.
Yep, you can. I just say, this is what we curated for Mondo and this complex disease entity, because that's how ClinGen works. But based on the assertion, which is what we do for our annotators, we don't necessarily have them use a Mondo to begin with, just because that can be tricky, but you can have anyone do it. If it says they have von Willebrand factor 2B, you find that Mondo, we can have them paste it in. And then you can have a Mondo ID, and that could be pasted in as a tag as well. So you can add DO IDs, Mondo IDs, OMIM IDs. I mean, you can really standardize any variant ID and have that person think about, as you're reading this, what is the word for what they have? What are we going to interpret that? Is there an ID for this already? Again, we made it kind of different and a little less assertive, because of the fact that the way we decide what a disease entity in ClinGen may be different from what other groups do. But that's why, as we go through, let me pick that limb-girdle annotation. What you will see when you look at these particular annotations here, I think this is it, is we didn't have them add a tag to begin with, but it's there, disease assertion, limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2F. Now, if we wanted to, we can say, what is the DO ID? What's the Mondo ID? What's the OMIM ID? That's equivalent to this. That certainly can be done if anyone wants to do that.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation of Hypothesis. I'll definitely take it back to Civic and see if you guys can connect, and we can talk to Jake and figure out how we can integrate it, because this seems like a really important tool.
Awesome. Yeah, it's nice just to have that additional layer of transparency. That's why, you know, with Matt, you can take this a lot of different places, but we even just want to see if we put these links up in our database and see how many times people have interest in seeing it. You know, will that just give us a measure and a metric to start with of the curiosity of people, right? And then start getting feedback from those individuals. Did you find this useful? Because certainly we, you know, can think of other ways. I'm hoping what we are capturing is useful because it is based on the evidence that we have for our ClinGen curations. But you can imagine that things may need to be adapted for different types of curations. I can imagine, you know, even actionability may have a different way that they want to capture data or publish it. But it's still, if it can be structured and standardized, then you can create that. All right, I think we are getting close to the end of time. So I want to make sure to do my due diligence. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't need to, sorry, stop sharing that screen yet, because I think I have the agenda. But my due diligence is, please remember that we have a break in our session that's going to happen from 11:30 to 11:45. And please, please come to those abstracts and posters. I'm going to place that in the chat. Everybody gave really nice time to develop these posters. It is in spatial. It's a really cool platform. You can move around, and the closer you get to people, you hear them. It's supposed to make it seem like you were in person at a conference. So go take a look at some of those posters and talk with them about their different efforts that they have done. And if any of you need the agenda, I'm also placing that in the chat as well. That has links to the rest of them. Following our poster session, we will have a main session that comes back around to let you know about the updated guidelines for ACMG AMP, as well as how we plan to in ClinGen to engage more underrepresented groups within our consortium. And then we will have those conclusions and the thanks and our ending talk at 2 p.m. Great. And if you have no more questions, we'll let you all get a little bit more of your break time. I'm sure everyone can use that. And thank you again. If you want, I'll put my email into the chat as well. If you have any questions for me about hypothesis, please feel free to send me an email. You can also use the clinical ClinGen at clinicalgenome.org general email. Tell them you have interest in hypothesis. It will get sent my way somehow. Great. Well, thanks everyone.